Good afternoon and welcome to the Revenue Cycle Truth Podcast, where we discuss everything revenue cycle, the latest trends, strategies, technologies, etc. And today, again, I'm glad to be joined with Glenn Krauss. Glenn was on our previous podcast, if you remember, where we talked about how to avoid denials. But now we're going to talk about some of the denial trends that we're both seeing. Glenn is a well-respected subject matter expert in denials and revenue cycle and collaborating with physicians to prevent denials. So I thought he would be great to have back and kind of delve into this hot topic today. So thanks for joining us, Glenn.
Oh, thank you very much, Josh. It's always a pleasure.
Great. So why don't you, I have a bunch that we put together. Why don't you start with some of the denials that you're seeing these days, and what are some of the trends you're seeing or some of the denial types that you're seeing, and talk through some of those.
Okay, great. Josh, I work in both the inpatient and outpatient arena, and I want to speak to what I'm seeing directly over and over again is hospitals are receiving a lot, and I mean a lot, increasing numbers of medical necessity denials, level of care downgrades, inpatient versus observation. We're seeing increasing volumes of clinical validation denials, meaning the payer says that the diagnosis like sepsis, acute hypoxemic respiratory failure, type 2 MIs, etc., severe protein carrying malnutrition, acute kidney injuries, and so forth. There's 7, which Dr. Martin calls top 7 sinister. They're questioning the validity on the clinical validation, meeting the payer's criteria, and they're taking them off the claim. The difference in reimbursement is sometimes 800, 2,000, 5,000. It's real money. And the third is, like I said, level of care downgrades. Medical necessity is a big one. Particularly with the 2 midnight rule for Medicare, managed Medicare, and straight Medicare. Those are the top denials I'm seeing. Of course, we're also seeing, as probably you're going to say, prior authorization, wrong diagnosis provided for authorization, and so forth. And go ahead.
Exactly.
Josh.
Yeah, and you stole some of my thunder. So yes, we have similar ones because we're seeing similar things. So let's talk through some of those. The leveling one is a huge one. We're seeing more and more of med necessities. It's getting more and more complex.
That's right.
From our perspective, we're diving deep into the payer policies, the clinical stance. We're reviewing the charts. We're writing very short to the point letters that are very topical. What are you seeing, or where are you focused? Are you more on the preventative side, and what are you doing to kind of offset some of these problems?
Great question. I've always said CDI should be instructing physicians and having a strong understanding and being able to operationalize the standards of documentation, which mean not more documentation. Proactive, like Dr. Martin, who I've worked with for 27 years. It should be proactive, preemptive, denial avoidance documentation. And I just finished reviewing a case, doing some training for a new CDI, and diving into a case that was denied. And it all goes back to 2 things, Josh, in summary, 2 key points. 1, the ED documentation doesn't support describe and reflect a patient's true clinical acuity. How severe signs and symptoms, what did the patient look like, how did it manifest, what's wrong with the patient. Okay, that leads to more than 50% of inpatient medical necessity and level of care downgrades.
Yeah, great point. Great point.
And the last thing,
I'm curious, with the emergency room leveling, we're kind of more reactive in nature, though what we do from a reactive standpoint does lead to some proactive. It sounds like you're doing a lot more proactive.
That's correct.
Prevention. But I've noticed these point systems that certain hospitals use that sometimes can be problematic as it relates to emergency room leveling. I'm just curious if you've run into that, or you have an experience with that, or what your thoughts are on these internal hospital point systems.
right? Okay, now we know for the doctor's E&M, this is important to know, that there is specific AMA CPT guidelines, 99281 through
Mhm.
285 and 99291, 292 for the critical care. For the hospital, they're supposed to come up with their own criteria. It's never changed when when the APCs came out, way back when the CMS said, come up with your own criteria. It has to be valid and reliable and time tested. Uh, One of the downfalls to that is, okay, they're based on interventions. Okay, how sick the patient is and what do we do about it? The piece that's really missing, Josh, that I want everyone to understand and appreciate and operationalize for documentation improvement is
Mm.
the actual documentation to show the starting of the patient's presentation. What did they look like? As I mentioned, uh, what's done? What are the provisional diagnosis differentials, medical decision making? That's the piece that's the weakest link. And if we don't have that information of what the patient looked like from the time they were brought in, how did they present, how did they arrive? Okay, what did they look like in the field from EMS's review and notes, okay, including our notes, and what was the stability of the patient or the lack thereof at the end when a decision was made to call the hospitalist to admit the patient. If we don't have a good patient story with doctors'
Great.
clinical
Yeah.
judgment,
Yeah.
we're dead.
Yeah, we're big on the, in writing the letters, you have to have a really good patient
That's
story. It has
right.
to tell a really succinct story. So I can see
Mhm.
that from your perspective.
That's
I,
right.
I was also kind of curious to pick your brain,
Yeah.
what your opinion is on the auditors that we're seeing, whether it's EXL, Cotivity.
Yeah.
We're seeing more and more of these things that are approved and then coming back via audit. What's your thoughts as it relates to prevention and CDI in terms of the
Okay.
audit?
Sure. Uh, well, I have to say, all the Cotivities and the other companies, HMS and all them, are they sometimes egregious? Absolutely. There's no question. I see it. Okay. Uh, on the other hand, there are times where I have to agree with them, unfortunately.
Right.
And it goes back to not just clinical indicators, what CDI look for to query a diagnosis. It goes back to what does the record portray from a clinical standpoint. It's not just the lab values for sepsis, lactic acid greater than 2, organ dysfunction related to sepsis has to be there. What does
Yep,
the record
exactly.
say? And that's not something CDI is traditionally looking at. They're primarily charged, and I'm not being negative. I'm just gonna summarize this.
Yeah, it's a very good point.
They're just checking for diagnosis, and they're missing that opportunity to really work with physicians to improve the patient's story. It's about the patient story.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, yeah, great. Okay, well, this is a good starting point. I want to continue, going down this topic, but maybe from here, I'll rattle off a few more that that are
Okay,
kind of
please.
showing their face more and more. I mean, we're seeing a lot of, related to cardio stress tests, right? Where the scans are done, but then it doesn't require authorization, but then
Mhm,
later on it does. There is a require for authorization. So things
mhm.
like that. I don't know. We're seeing for colonoscopies where, there's certain procedures done and then it denies for authorization. I think this is what you were getting at too, right?
Right,
GI panels, all these
yeah,
types of things, which are
and the other
problematic
thing.
and becoming more problematic.
Right. Okay. Colonoscopies. Okay. Sometimes it gets into trouble because it starts out as a screening, which is covered, mandated coverage under the Affordable Care Act. Then it turns into a diagnostic because I have a polyp, and
Right.
oftentimes the correct modifier is not used. And so
Yep.
the payer didn't understand that it was a screening to begin with, so that causes a denial. Some denials are self-inflicted. Other quick areas that I just mentioned earlier before the podcast is there are 8 specific outpatient procedures that need to be prior authorization by Medicare. Things like uh, 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 things like what do you call it? Appendectomies or nasal procedures, rhinoplasties, vein stripping that have tendency to be cosmetic in nature. And if we don't get authorization ahead of time, you're not going to get paid.